So the information for the reproductive system is in the OpenStax textbook in chapter 27, and I have to say they did handle it rather briefly. And this is going to be in more than one part. We're really focusing on the anatomy, so structure, function in this first part. It's kind of reminding you of the roles of the female reproductive system. They, like males, all have to produce the gametes, and so gametes in females are called eggs, or ova is plural, ovum is singular. They have to release the female hormones, so estrogens. Yes, there's 3 different types of estrogen. Estradiol is the most active. I just call them estrogens, and the other one is progesterone. They will receive the sperm, provide a site for fertilization, implantation, and development to term, and then facilitate parturition. Parturition is just a fancy word for labor and delivery. Then once, because we're talking caveman, cavewoman, provide nourishment via the mammary glands. And so we'll talk about that. I think this textbook kept it with development, but we'll talk about it once we make Cave Kid. So the primary sex organs, females, are the site of oogenesis. So oogenesis is the production of the gametes, so eggs. And like I said, the female hormones are estrogens, progesterones. So here are the ovaries. There's 2, right and left. They're going to be in the pelvic cavity. And then secondary sex organs are structures that are essential for all aspects, reproduction, so fertilization, implantation, and then labor and delivery. So eggs, actually oocytes, are going to be released from the ovaries, and it's presumed that they alternate monthly. These eggs will be released during a process called ovulation. The egg is going to be released actually into the peritoneal cavity because notice the ovaries are not connected to the rest of the female reproductive tract. So the egg will be swept into the uterine or the fallopian tube, and then this widened portion called the ampulla is where fertilization ideally takes place. Then if there is fertilization, then the conceptus, which is what it's called at that time, will make its way through the uterine tubes into the uterus. So right here is the uterus, and that is the womb. And then the conceptus will implant into the womb, and then it's called an embryo. And that is where it will stay and develop. Then we have the cervix, so that's the neck portion of the uterus, and then the female vagina is the entrance and exit, if you will, to the female reproductive tract, so that along with the external reproductive organs, the vulva is the organ for copulation. So copulation, sex, coitus, intercourse, whatever word you like to use. The vagina is also going to be an exit portal for menstrual flow, and also it's the birth canal. And then the mammary glands are necessary for nourishment. So those are all secondary sex organs. So if you think the size, they always compare organs to fruit, okay? So the size of a uterus in a female that has not had children is about the size of a small pear. Don't you like that? So it's a pear, an upside down pear, if you will. Then when it houses a human, so think of a human full term, then it will grow to basically fill up the majority of the abdominal pelvic cavity. This will also be a moving fetus. So there has to be some support to the female reproductive system. And so there is a series of ligaments. And so if you look at this picture, it looks like angel wings. It's not angel wings. That's called the broad ligament. And the broad ligament is going to be a fold of peritoneum that basically tends over and covers all the reproductive organs and attaches them to the body wall. Okay, so it's I kind of look at it like duct tape, okay? Clearly, since it's going to move, there also has to be some sort of flexibility in those, but this is going to give support to the uterine tubes, the uterus, and the vagina. Then we have the suspensory ligaments, and I'm going to show you another picture in a moment, but these suspensory ligaments are right here, and they are going to contain ovarian vessels. And they are going to suspend, if you want to think about them, sort of hanging the ovaries laterally on the pelvic wall. The ovaries are not attached to the uterine tubes, but they are attached to the body of the uterus by the ovarian ligament. And then there is another ligament called the round ligament, and they don't really have a nice picture over here, so I borrowed this one from the internet. Okay, so the round ligament is going to be analogous to the gubernaculum in that it will exit out the inguinal canal, and then it is going to, the fibers are going to basically spread out into the mons pubis, which is a fat pad, and the labia majora. This is going to keep a forward tilt, okay, a forward tilt to that uterus. This is going to be important when there's a child developing inside the uterus to keep the uterus forward off of the intestine. There's still going to be some compression to the intestine, but mom needs to digest her food and also eliminate her waste. And so that is responsible for that anteversion. You can see it's attached sort of at the top part of the uterus. There's some stretching that is needed during pregnancy, and often this is going to cause pain to the mother. So many women experience round ligament pain during pregnancy, just because it's not something that stretches well. It is also going to be anchored to the sacrum. So remember, the sacrum is the lower part of the vertebral column, so there's also a uteral sacral ligament. But you can see why the female reproductive system needs some support. And so those are all supporting ligaments. And so this is looking inside the pelvic cavity. And so you can see that the ovaries, oh, and they're roughly the size of almonds. So pears and almonds, everyone. That's what we're talking about today. You can see the suspensory ligaments, and then you see the broad ligament and how it's going to keep it attached. And then the round ligament, like I said, that's going to be the one that exits out the pelvic cavity through the inguinal canal and keeps that uterus anteverted, tilted forward.
The female reproductive system includes a number of parts. The ovaries hold the eggs, which are released each month during childbearing age. They also produce sex hormones, which control periods. The fallopian tubes connect the ovaries to the womb, also called the uterus. When an egg is released, it travels down the fallopian tube towards the womb. At this time, sperm from the male can pass into the fallopian tube, where it may meet the egg and fertilize it. Fertilized eggs pass down the fallopian tube to the womb, which holds and protects the baby during pregnancy. The lining of the womb is called the endometrium. It thickens during the menstrual cycle, ready for pregnancy. If you don't become pregnant, you have a period, which is when the lining sheds. The cervix is the lower part of the womb. It is the opening into the vagina. During a period or menstruation, blood passes from the womb through the cervix and then to the vagina. The vagina also opens and expands during sexual intercourse and stretches during childbirth to allow a baby to come out. On the outside of the body is the vulva. It is made up of 2 pairs of lips. Between these is the opening of the vagina. Above the vagina is the urethra, the short tube that carries urine from the bladder to outside the body. And above the urethra is the clitoris, a very sensitive area that gives sexual pleasure. For more information about cancers that can start in the female reproductive system, go to cruk.org/.
Okay. So let's go ahead and color our way through the female reproductive system. All right, so right here, there's a right and a left, but this is the location of the ovaries. They are the primary sex organs for females. They will make and release ova, usually just 1 per month. And like I said, it's just presumed that they alternate monthly. Also, the ovaries are responsible for making female sex hormones. So estrogens, and like I said, there's 3 of them: estradiol, estrone, and estriol. Usually made at different times of a female's life. But estradiol is the one that is made during the reproductive years and is the most potent. and the other one is progesterone. And we'll talk about the effects of those. We'll talk about the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle later. So our next structure are the uterine tubes or fallopian tubes, but there's two parts. So right now I'm just sort of pointing to this little fringe part. So these little fringe-like extensions, they are an extension of the uterine or fallopian tubes, but they have their own name. They're called fimbriae. One would be a fimbria, but no one just talks about one piece of fringe. Their job is at ovulation, which is usually day 14 or mid-cycle of a female ovarian cycle. The oocyte is released from the ovary. And so that's called ovulation. And it's going to be released out here in the abdominal pelvic cavity because it is open. And so it's the fringe on the uterine tube. They are going to sweep up that oocyte into the uterine tube. This does not always work perfectly. So sometimes oocytes are released out into the pelvic cavity, and sometimes they're fertilized. And so the rest of it is the uterine tubes, oviducts, or fallopian tubes. So fallopian from Gabriel Fallope is the guy, and he got to name him after himself. They're roughly 4 inches long, but they're going to be the conduit for the conceptus. So it's a site of fertilization, usually in that widened portion called the ampulla. It is a passageway to our next structure, the uterus. It is going to have mucosa, submucosa, and then it's going to be covered and tented over by the broad ligament. But the smooth muscle is going to have peristalsis going towards the uterus. There will also be cilia lining that mucosa that are going to beat and row towards the uterus. There's also cells that are going to secrete nutrients and basically keep the sperm and the egg and the conceptus nourished and moist. Because this ductwork is open, it leads the female vulnerable to PID, which is pelvic inflammatory disease. If they're sexually transmitted infections, they can work their way up through the female reproductive tract and out into the peritoneum. So high fever, cramping, bleeding are usually signs of pelvic inflammatory disease. If there's untreated STIs and you get this amount of inflammation, it can also cause scarring. I have a better picture, but there's a very narrow portion of the uterine tubes called the isthmus, and so we'll look at that, and we'll talk about ectopic pregnancy in a moment.
Ovulation is a part of the menstrual cycle when the ovary releases a ripe egg, or ovum. Inside the ovary are hundreds of thousands of follicles. Each follicle is a hollow ball of cells with an immature egg in the center. The typical 28-day menstrual cycle begins on the first day of menstrual bleeding. During the first 7 days of the cycle, a few follicles begin to grow at the same time. These maturing follicles secrete estrogen hormone into the bloodstream to prepare the lining of the uterus for pregnancy. Around day 7, all of the follicles stop growing and begin to degenerate, except for one. This dominant follicle continues to grow and nourishes the developing egg inside it. Around day 12, the follicle secretes a large amount of estrogen into the bloodstream. When the estrogen reaches the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland in the brain, the anterior or front part of the pituitary gland releases a huge surge of luteinizing hormone into the bloodstream. Around day 14, luteinizing hormone causes the follicle to undergo a sudden growth spurt. Right before ovulation, the egg detaches from the inside of the follicle. The bulging follicle releases chemicals, causing one of the two fallopian tubes to move in closer and surround the follicle. The follicle swells until it bursts open, ejecting the egg and fluid from the follicle into the abdominal cavity. In response, the fimbriae, tiny projections at the end of the fallopian tube, sweep across the ovulation site and pick up the egg. Microscopic cilia on the fimbriae surface transport the egg to the entrance of the fallopian tube. Inside the walls of the fallopian tube, muscular contractions gently push the egg towards the uterus. After ovulation, the egg lives for 12 to 24 hours, so it must be fertilized by a sperm from the male during this time for a woman to become pregnant. If it's not fertilized, the egg dissolves away and is shed along with the uterine lining during menstruation.
Okay, so uterine tube, site of fertilization, it's also passageway to the uterus, so that's where the conceptus has to make the journey. It is highly folded. We'll look at it in lab. We have a little histology lab on Monday. But you can kind of see that the mucosa is folded, for one, and then there are hair-like projections, and so this is a prettier picture. So these are the cilia that are going to be rowing towards the uterus. And then you also have these cells that are called PEG cells. They're going to basically keep the egg, the sperm, the conceptus moist and nourished as it makes its way towards the uterus. And that's going to take a few days for it to get there. Even though I get it, it's only 4 inches, but it takes a while for the conceptus to make its way to the uterus, and that's going to take a few days for implantation. So we'll talk about that later. So problems with the ovaries and the uterine tubes, it not being a closed system and being an open system. The oocyte can be released anywhere in the peritoneum, and sperm will move and can swim out the uterine tube as well. So you can get fertilization outside of the female reproductive tract. So that's called an ectopic pregnancy. If it's anywhere other than the uterus, you get an implantation. Okay. Most often, though, an ectopic pregnancy is going to be in this narrow portion right before it gets to the uterus called the isthmus. It's roughly the width of a human hair. And like I said, we'll look at it in cross-section. It's also very folded. And so the conceptus can get stuck, and then it starts to grow and develop, and that's when you have a tubal ectopic pregnancy. As it gets larger, though, it can basically burst the uterine tube, and so rupture it, and so that can cause severe bleeding. So that is an emergency, and so that will have to be surgically, the bleeding has to be controlled, and then the tube may or may not be able to be repaired. Pelvic inflammatory disease, like I said, number one cause is going to be chlamydia, and then the second is going to be gonorrhea. And like I said, often in females, these are going to be asymptomatic, so unless a female is getting tested regularly, she may not know that she has these infections, but meanwhile it's worked its way through the reproductive tract, and you have chronic inflammation, which we learned is not a good thing. And so if you get thickening of that mucosa and lining, what can happen is that will thicken this area, and then this tube becomes blocked, and so therefore the sperm cannot reach the oocyte, and so that female would be infertile. These bacterial diseases can also work their way up through the male reproductive tract as well, and also cause inflammation and block the sperm transporting duct. So if it gets to the ductus deferens or vas deferens, then that too can greatly, it can block off the flow of sperm from one testicle or the other and lower sperm count. So it can cause, it's a major cause of infertility. Also, if you have a bacterial infection out here in the peritoneum, then it can go to the bloodstream. You can have sepsis and can cause death if untreated. Because that's the passageway for the sperm to get to the egg, tubal ligation is a way to surgically sterilize a female if a female doesn't want to have children anymore. And they can do it, they do it through laparoscopy now. They'll basically cut, cauterize, clip, clamp somehow so sperm can never reach the egg. 100% effective. All right. So we have ovary, primary sex organ, fimbriae are going to sweep in that oocyte, uterine tube, site of fertilization, and passageway to the uterus. So there's 3 layers to this uterus. So, and then make a line. I don't know if I gave you the line or not. So this is going to be the cervix, this is the body, and the fundus of the uterus. So the uterus is going to be the site of implantation and development, so the womb. And the inner lining is called the endometrium. So this inner layer is the endometrium. This is the layer that is going to grow in response to ovarian hormones. So this is the layer that grows and is shed monthly through menstruation or menses. And this is also the layer the conceptus will implant. And then we have an embryo, and that is when a woman becomes officially pregnant. So endo means in, so endometrium. You may have heard of endometriosis. So these cells of the endometrium, like I said, they will grow and respond to particularly estrogen, the first part of a female ovarian cycle, and so they will grow and proliferate. Because menstrual flow, if you think about it, if there is no pregnancy, a female's body prepares to receive a pregnancy every month. Menstrual flow is just supposed to flow out, but since it's not open, you can see how some of those cells and some of the sloughing of that endometrium can get out into the peritoneum. This is supposed to be removed by macrophages, so the female's immune system, and they don't really know for what reason. In some women, it is not removed, and so therefore there's cells outside of the uterus that then will grow and respond to ovarian hormones. Okay, and so this too can lead to chronic inflammation. So usually it's just very painful, very heavy periods. But the big problem is it can lead to sterility as well. And then you would have the same problem as a pelvic inflammatory disease. So again, block conceptus reaching the uterus, so ectopic pregnancies. And so often birth control pills, so monitoring the female cycle is a way to control endometriosis. All right, so the middle layer, so we have endometrium. The middle layer is the myometrium. So myo means muscle. So this is a muscular layer. So interlacing directions. It is going to contract during childbirth, and it also contracts during female orgasm. It is going to be responsive to oxytocin. Which causes the contractions. So endometrium is the layer that responds to ovarian hormones. It grows, it's shed monthly. The layer for implantation. The myometrium is smooth muscle. And then the outermost layer is the perimetrium. So the perimetrium is on the uterus itself, so it's the visceral peritoneum of the uterus, so it is serosa, so serous membrane. And then you'd have the broad ligament kind of tenting over that. So inner, myo, think middle, so M in middle. And then peri means around. So like the perimeter of a room goes around. So peri layers are always on the outside. So this picture is looking at the uterus, and this layer is the endometrium, and there's 2 parts to it. So there's the functional layer of the endometrium, and so this is the part that would grow and be shed And then the deeper layer is called the stratum basalis. And so that word base is in there, so that's the base. These are going to be cells that will stay. They do not get sloughed off. They're the ones that are going to regenerate and grow that endometrial lining. And it gets grown every monthly cycle a female has. And also you can see so clearly it is going to be a very vascular organ. These spiral arteries, they are going to grow into that layer. It prepares for implantation and pregnancy every month. So the second half of a female cycle is called the secretory phase in the uterus. And this lining is going to get thick and nutritious because it's going to be that endometrial lining that's going to nourish the embryo until a placenta forms. And so there's going to be all kinds of things in the endometrial lining that are going to feed that embryo. And so they also have these uterine glands, which make uterine milk. And so it's like just sugars, amino acids, vitamins, anything that that embryo would need. Also binding proteins for the conceptus to stick and to implant. So if there is no pregnancy, we'll look at the hormones in a minute, but progesterone is going to drop. So for gestation, and these spiral arteries are going to start to dilate and contract and basically cut off or slough off that functional layer. And so that's how that happens. And you see the myometrium, and then the perimetrium would be on the outside. And so we'll look at that in lab. All right, so this neck portion, it's still part of the uterus, but it's called the cervix. And so the cervix, remember cervical region means neck. So just this portion right here is the cervix of the uterus. And so it's entry into the womb. And there's an internal opening called the internal os, and then there's an external opening called the external os. And then in the passageway, the canal part, these are going to be cells that are going to secrete mucus. And that mucus is going to be thick, except at mid-cycle when ovulation occurs. Also, since it does make mucus, it also makes secretions that are going to lubricate the vagina as well. Because that mucus does thin mid-cycle around ovulation, the time when a female is most fertile is also the time of most fluid in the vagina. A pap smear is when a sample of cells is taken from the external part, so that external os area, so around here, and so that cervical orifice. And those cells are collected, they're sent off to a pathology lab, and it is a screen for cervical cancer. They now know that cervical cancers, some say 90% or more, or 99% of all cervical cancers are initiated by a chronic human papillomaviral infection. And so now we have a vaccine for the oncogenic or cancer-causing strains of HPV.
Don't they give those to teenagers?
They do. So the idea is you need to get the shots before someone is sexually active because HPV is so very prevalent in humans. So it's assumed if most people, if they have had sex or coitus, that they've been exposed.
So the human papillomavirus, it's a very common virus, and it's estimated that approximately 80% of women are exposed to the virus at some point during their lifetime. Fortunately, the vast majority of women are able to clear their virus through an intact immune system. But it's the smaller proportion of cases, a very small proportion of cases that the women are unable to clear the virus. It leads to HPV persistence. And the pathway, the carcinogenesis pathway, it takes many, many years to develop into cervical cancer. And on average, it's probably about 10 to 15 years. And that's why screening is so important, because we can intervene before cervical cancer even develops.
So the vast majority are HPV associated, and only a tiny fraction, like 1% or so, are not related to the virus. There are about 15 different types that are associated with cancer. Not all HPV viruses are associated with cancer. And as Dr. Lee said, the vast majority of women clear this spontaneously. without needing further treatment. That said, for those where the virus persists, and the populations who are at highest risk are those who do not have an immune system that's intact, whether it's because of HIV, chronic exposure to steroids, or other cancer treatments. In these women, the risk of it progressing over a long period of time is high.
Yeah.
So your book did a little special box on how we get to cervical cancer. Like I said, the fact that we have a vaccine for this, we could actually cure cervical cancer. Our numbers for cervical cancer, because we have been doing pap smears, it's part of a female reproductive exam, if a female does go for that, our counts are fairly low. However, globally, it's still a problem, and it is a deadly cancer with a high mortality rate. It is slow growing, but there are no symptoms. So like I said, if a woman isn't being screened, she would have no idea if she had that. There is a genetic susceptibility. So P53 is a tumor suppressor, and I just thought that was so cute that your book kind of does this. Before a cell divides, cells go through a series of checkpoints, and one of them before a cell divides is to make sure that the DNA is intact and doesn't have DNA errors. And that is the job of that P53 protein. If that P53 isn't working, it's like having a bad proofreader for your English paper. Okay, somebody missed a mistake, and then that cell now has mistakes and will start to grow. And cancer, in essence, is unregulated cell growth. And so if a female does have abnormal cells, which is what they're looking for, they can, it's not like they have to have their uterus removed or anything like that, they can actually freeze those cells and scrape those cells off. And so like I said, screening is really important. We're doing a better job. And now that teenagers and people are being immunized against HPV, that should really drop those numbers, and we could actually cure this type of cancer if people just get vaccinated. So. And then HPV causes genital warts, which is often asymptomatic. Okay, so we have ovaries, uterine tubes, uterus with the cervix, and then this is the vagina. And just our landmarks, so pubic symphysis, urinary bladder, urethra, vagina. It is the entrance and exit, so it is the copulatory organ along with the vulva. It is also the passageway for menstrual flow or infant, so it's also called the birth canal. It is a potential space, meaning it is normally closed. There are folds, it's called rugae, to accommodate stretch for what it is receiving or what it's exiting. The resident microbiome, one of the key genus of bacteria, is lactobacillus. The walls, like I said, under the effects of estrogen, are going to release glycogen, which is carbohydrate, which those microorganisms can then ferment and produce acid. That acid is protective against pathogens, so STIs. It is also, kind of makes the sperm not want to swim, so it's a bit hostile as far as the sperm are concerned. Because the microbiome has to become established, and it isn't until puberty that there's adequate estrogen to get the glycogen to basically feed that microbial population, adolescents tend to have a more alkaline pH as well as postmenopausal women, which leaves them more subject to other bacteria growing, dysbiosis, sexually transmitted infections, and as far as adolescents, also it's easier to get pregnant in adolescence.
Wow.
If it's not acidic. Yes, just when you probably need the most protection of all. At the distal end, this is where the hymen would be located, and so it's just that inner mucosa. It's always going to be mucosa, smooth muscle, and then there is a fibroelastic outer covering to the vagina. It has to be a tough organ, since a human will pass out. So it has an outer adventitia. And so this is our histology slide, and you can see that has folds, as rugae. It's going to be stratified squamous, because also think abrasion. And then it has a basement membrane, and then there's going to be outer longitudinal inner circular layers of smooth muscle as part of vaginal tone, also pelvic support. The vagina will elongate when a female gets aroused. Also, it will contract during orgasm. And even menstruation, it will also contract to help move menstrual flow out. So it is an active organ. And of course, through childbirth, also in childbirth, it will be an active layer. It has an outer, like I said, fibrous elastic tissue, an adventitia. The myth of the hymen, yes. And culturally, being a virgin and being presented at marriage is a big thing. So there are actually plastic surgeons that will restore a hymen. But as you can see, not all females have a hymen. It comes in perforated. It can be imperforate, where at birth the surgeon is just going to open that up. It's, like I said, it's thin. It is, however, vascular, which most of the time mucosa is not. So that is the myth of the vagina. They think about only 40% of females will have a hymen that ruptures during coitus. Since you can see it, this is kind of thin anyway. I think your book talks about physical activity can also rupture. All right. There's right and left. So in this picture, there's two of them. So they're vestibular glands. So posterior and laterally to the vaginal orifice or opening. The old-timey name, I almost forgot it, Bartholin's glands. There's a vestibule, so I like vestibular glands, but if you want to go with Bartholin, go ahead. They are homologous to the bulbourethral glands. When a female becomes aroused, they will release a slippery lubricant for the vestibule. So the vestibule is the area inside the labia minora, which we're getting to. And that's to moisten this area and allow for easy insertion. Okay, so collectively, the external genitalia of a female is called the vulva. It is made up of, there is a fat pad, there are two folds. We just watched the video. So we have the labia majora, labia minora, and then there are also structures underneath. So the labia or lips stay closed to protect the openings. This is anterior, this is posterior. So the urethra is first, and then the vagina. I've met with some students going to nursing school. They had to learn how to do catheters, and the big thing was, do not stick this in the vagina. Okay, so yep, urethra's first, so more anterior, then vagina, and then anus. The area inside of the labia minora is called the vestibule. Underneath the labia are also erectile bodies, and here's the clitoris, and so prepuce is the basically foreskin of the clitoris. So if you pull that away, that exposes the tip of the clitoris, which is the glans clitoris. And so the clitoris is actually longer and larger and is erectile tissue, so hard erectile tissue. So I guess homologous to the corpora cavernosa. And then they're also what's called the bulb of the vestibule. And so that is erectile tissue underneath the labia, so soft erectile tissue, which would be homologous to the corpus spongiosum. Okay, and so upon arousal, they get engorged, so there's more gripping, if you will. If you're trying to make cave, kid, right, we gotta get to climax. All right, so mons pubis is the fat pad overlying the pubic symphysis, and that's just for comfort. Labia majora is going to be it's skin, not pink, so hair, sweat glands. And then the labia minora is with the part with the lips without skin. And the boundaries, this whole area is the vestibule, okay, so entrance. Then we have the vestibular or Bartholin glands, that is the old name, and that is for that lubrication. And the clitoris is erectile tissue, high concentration of nerves, just like the glans penis. It is for pleasure. All right, so let's color it. So up here, that is just a fat pad. There is a bone there. So bone striking bone is not comfortable. And if sex weren't fun and comfortable, there'd be no people. We'd just play cards or eat a pizza or something. It is in the mons pubis that the fibers from the round ligament, and I think that's what this sort of lame picture is trying to show, but it doesn't do it all the way. And that's for that anteversion or tilting forward of the uterus. So mons pubis, fat pad, clitoris, erectile tissue. Homologous to penis, it comes from the same embryological tissue. Female climax is not responsible to make cave kid, but it does encourage more cave kids. All right, this is a better picture. Okay, so this shows the margins of the vestibule with the labia minora. This whole area right here is called the perineum. I don't think your book mentions it, but it never tells you exactly what that is. So if we take the skin away, like I said, you can kind of see that you have the body of the clitoris, which is underneath and can't be seen. You have the glans clitoris, which is the part that is visible. And then the crus is also going to attach this. If you remember, the penis also has a crus. And then we have the bulb of the vestibule, which would be softer erectile tissue like the corpus spongiosum. So when we learn about embryological development and the production or development of the reproductive organs, it's going to be from the same embryological tissue, just under the effect of different hormones, we get the different structures. So that's when they say homologous to blah, blah, blah. So homologous means same in structure, came from same embryological tissue. And then here are the greater vestibular glands, or the Bartholin glands, that release their lubricant upon arousal. And so there's two small openings or ducts. And so it's going to lubricate the vaginal orifice. Okay, so labia minora. So that makes up the margin of the vestibule. So no hair. Anteriorly to the labia minora is going to make up the prepuce or foreskin of the clitoris. So right here. And then deep to that is the bulb of the vestibule, so the erectile tissue. And then labia majora. So labia majora encloses and protects the urethral and the vaginal openings or orifices. And collectively, the external genitalia is called the vulva, and along with the vagina is the copulatory organ, or the organs used for sex.
So the labia majora includes like the normal skin around it?
Yes.
Okay. I didn't know that.
Also, they're larger, so major, and then minor is smaller. Okay, and so we just kind of colored, but I do want you to notice that, just think about all of the things that we say that these organs are responsible for. I like this picture, just shows that there is a very rich blood supply that goes to all of these organs, and that was kind of left out. And like in lab, we'll do a histology lab. So I have some slides, so we'll see the endometrium, myometrium, perimetrium of the uterus, and then we are also going to look at an ovary, which is a hot mess. But we will look at an ovary. As far as female sexual response, it's going to follow the same pattern as male. And so parasympathetic is going to cause increased blood flow and arousal, so filling of erectile tissues. Breasts will also swell, nipples become erect. Vagina will expand and elongate and get increased secretions. The vestibular glands, like I said, will also then lubricate the vestibule. Then with enough stimulus, however that may occur, there will be a sympathetic reflex, which will also cause a release of oxytocin from the pituitary gland, which will cause pleasurable smooth muscle contractions of orgasm and climax of the perineum, uterus, and uterine tube, so all of those muscles. Females, there is no refractory period as there is in the male sexual response. Okay. Okay, make sure your name is written on your paper. You're going to upload that to the appropriate assignment Dropbox.